Welcome, everyone, to the Voices of NCAJ podcast. It's the podcast for the North Carolina Advocates for Justice. I am Amber Nimitz, your host and Director of External Affairs for NCAJ. Before we get started, I'd like to thank today's episode sponsor, Advocate Capital. Advocate is passionate about helping plaintiffs' attorneys get better results for their clients, mainly through their AdvoTrack case expense funding service. It allows firms to track case expenses and recover borrowing costs, which makes the net cost of borrowing zero on cases they win. And you can learn more about that at advocatecapital.com. I'm excited to welcome today's guest, Emily Beeson. Emily is an attorney practicing with Ward Black Law in Greensboro, where she focuses her practice on defective medical devices, dangerous drugs and products, and workers' compensation law. She is a former chair of NCAJ's Products Liability, Class Action, and Mass Tort section, and a graduate of NCAJ's Next Leadership Program. Emily is one of half a dozen outstanding presenters who will be sharing their wisdom and expertise at our upcoming fall conference for paralegals. The program is on October 18th, and you can register for it at ncaj.com/events. Emily, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Amber. I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the event, the CLE.
Yeah, so are we. So your presentation at Fall Conference for Paralegals is Managing Client Expectations, a paralegal's guide to keeping calm and carrying on. So tell me, what is the role that paralegals play in shaping client expectations?
Well, there is some variation among firms, but for a lot of us, paralegals are the primary point of contact for clients. They interface between the clients and the attorneys. And so the paralegals must be able to field questions coming in from clients. You know, they are handling numerous cases at once, and they have to be able to answer a phone call that they're not expecting, and provide a good enough answer to the client that that client is satisfied and kind of understands what's going on with the case. One way that that can be tricky is kind of interpreting the legalese from the lawyer, or explaining complex legal procedures to a client who doesn't have any experience in the legal field. And so it's really important for paralegals to have not only a good understanding of the type of law that they practice, but also a good ability to connect with clients, to understand their questions and understand how to explain it in a way that the clients will understand.
So a good paralegal can speak attorney, but they can also speak regular person.
Right. They can be the interpreter between the legalese and the layperson. And again, that's so important. When we talk about motions and hearings and depositions, a lot of clients, they don't speak that language. They've never heard of a deposition or don't understand the process. And paralegals really play a huge role in helping the clients come to that understanding.
So what are some common misconceptions that clients will have about the legal process that paralegals have to help them through?
Yeah. One thing that I have come up against numerous times is clients who think that their lawyer has a lot more power than we do, right? So I like to think that being a lawyer, we do have a lot of power, but we have to work within the confines of the court. We have to be able to convince a judge that our position is the correct position. And a lot of times we have to follow the timeline set forth by the rules or by the discovery scheduling order. And we can't just push ahead to accomplish some of the tasks that we're working on for our clients. And so to help them understand that after we file this motion, we're going to have to wait for the defendant to respond. Then we're going to have to, have a certain amount of time that we can respond. And then we have to wait for the hearing to be scheduled. Just explaining that there are schedules kind of built in to the legal process, and that we can't necessarily control the timeline is a lot of times difficult for people to understand.
Right, right. And so a lot of this really does come down to just setting the realistic expectations about those timelines and outcomes for the client, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one important thing to remember is that you don't have to wait until you get to, negotiations or get to a hearing to discuss that with the client. You want to go ahead and set that expectation out at the forefront so that they know, hey, we're going to go through this process, but it is going to take X amount of time. And these are the possible outcomes. This is the one we want, but this other outcome that is not the one we want is also a possibility. And so those are conversations that I think are best to begin having at the very front, at the very beginning of representation.
Hmm. So how many different paralegals have you worked with throughout your career? Any idea?
Oh, oh, I would say around 10
Hmm.
total.
Okay.
I've done, a few different practice areas at a few different firms.
Okay. And what are the hallmarks of the best ones you've worked with? Are there any that you met and you just knew right away, okay, I'm in good hands with this paralegal because I know that they know these things. I can tell already.
Yeah, of course. So a lot of it, I think, comes with experience, but a paralegal who can anticipate the needs of the case, again, kind of at the beginning of the case, as a legal professional that there are certain steps that we're going to have to go through to get to the resolution of this case, whatever that may be. And a paralegal who understands that process and can go ahead and begin preparing for the next step before the attorney has to ask him or her to do so is incredibly helpful. I mean, it's invaluable. And paralegals who really stay organized, keep a strong calendar, can, remind attorneys that get so busy and overwhelmed and, can easily kind of let something slip. Paralegals are who I know and many other attorneys rely on to kind of keep us on the track and keep the trains running. They provide an essential role in legal representation. Even though maybe the lawyers get a lot of the notoriety, the paralegals really do a ton of work to get cases where they need to be. And I was a paralegal before I became a lawyer. So I feel like I kind of can see both sides of the coin, and I have a huge respect for my paralegals that I've worked with who have really demonstrated the ability to get the work done and get it done well and get it done on time.
And how long were you a paralegal?
3 years.
3 years. And did you know when you became a paralegal that you would want to pursue a career as a lawyer?
I had no idea. So I studied Spanish in college and got a position at a law firm as a bilingual case manager and kind of graduated into a paralegal role. And, you know, after I had been doing it for a little while, I thought this is a great opportunity for growth. And I think it was really beneficial for me to have the experience of being a paralegal before going to law school, because then once I became a lawyer, I kind of had some insider knowledge about how cases really work, which is something that law school doesn't necessarily teach you very clearly.
Right. You had that logistical, practical understanding of the way that the theoretical things that you were learning in law school actually happened.
Exactly.
Well, that must have made law school a very interesting experience for you if you know, like seeing if you had seen it from the where the rubber hits the road to how the, imagined, how everything was imagined it's supposed to be. That
Yeah, it's a very different perspective for sure to be kind of in the trenches and doing the daily work and then step away and research kind of how we got here.
hmm Wow. So what do you this is a little bit off topic, but I think that folks listening to this podcast might be interested to know what is it that as a paralegal you still remember that experience and thinking, I really wish my lawyer would knew this or understood this about the job that we're doing together?
Ooh, that is a tough one. I think in my practice and in my experience, the lawyer is usually in contact with the client at the beginning and in contact with the client at the end of the case, and not necessarily throughout the case, that primary point, because again, the paralegal frequently plays that role. And so just to understand how frequently clients may have questions, and I think I have learned through that experience, the thing about setting the expectations at the beginning and putting things in writing to the client early on and frequently throughout the case, that can really cut down on clients, maybe forgetting the answer to a question that they had and then calling again. I guess that's
Mm-hmm.
maybe
Yeah,
one of the things that I learned. Yeah.
that's great. That's great. And so, do you have any tips about the explaining legal jargon in layman's terms? This is something I guess you've had to do in English and in Spanish.
Yeah, yeah. So a little more difficult for me in Spanish since I'm not a native speaker, but yeah, I feel like I've developed enough proficiency, and at least in my practice areas. If you threw me into criminal law, I wouldn't have a clue how to explain anything in Spanish to a client. But one of my early mentors always recommended that when you are trying to explain a difficult concept to a client, explain it as if you were talking to a third grader. So, third grade, it's pretty young, but they can understand concepts if you explain things in, kind of basic, simple terminology. And I've found that even whether it's a verbal conversation or if you're writing a letter, if you kind of break things down, remember that not everybody is a lawyer and understands these terms, and break it down as if you're explaining it to a third grader. That's going to get across to everybody. And I don't think that it offends people. They don't feel like you're talking down to them. Um, but they get that understanding and can grasp the concepts and the timelines and what's going on with their case.
Yeah, I was a newspaper reporter for a long time, and that's basically the baseline level of what you're writing, especially when you're writing about something complicated for a general audience, not a specialized audience. So yeah, that makes sense. Um, and so one of the other things that you're going to address in your presentation is empathy and the role that a legal professional, a paralegal, that the role that empathy plays in the interaction with the client. I mean, a lot of what you've described is very logistical, very like cut and dry, but you have to strike a balance, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for pointing out that I am focusing on the logistics and the procedure, because that is something that I have to remind myself of when I'm going into a conversation with a client, because as legal professionals, we deal with cases involving, serious injuries or other catastrophic events. We deal with those types of cases every day. And so it's easy to become, I don't know if the right word is jaded, but kind of used to talking about somebody's terrible injury without having that empathy. And so before you have a conversation with a client, I find that it's really important to just step back and remind yourself that for this client, for this person, this is probably the only time in their, hopefully the only time in their lives that they're going to be dealing with what was probably a life-changing traumatic experience. And if they're going to put their trust in us, and if we're going to be successful in our representation of them, we have to kind of step out from behind the curtain, behind our rules and procedures, and really connect with them on a personal level and understand what they're going through. And I think it's important. It's important for lawyers. It's important for paralegals being the primary contact for these clients. And really, it's important for everybody at a law firm who might be answering the phone to remember that.
Hmm. How do you keep yourself from becoming too involved emotionally? That's got to be a challenge, especially when you're first doing this kind of work, because as you said, I mean, there are some pretty heart-wrenching stories that you're dealing with, heart-wrenching stories being told by like people who are coming to you for help. So, I mean, that's got to be tough.
Yeah, I think that depending on your involvement in the case and how difficult you have to advocate for people in order to achieve a certain outcome, you may end up getting really incredibly involved with them and getting to know their family. You know, if you're going to trial for somebody, you're probably going to get to know them a lot more than you necessarily intended to, just because of the nature of the beast, of trying to get their story to connect with a jury, right? You want to know them. You want to be able to pull out those details. Um, but I think maybe another side of that is when you're dealing with catastrophic injuries, or at least just injuries that impact somebody's life every day, you can have the secondary trauma, right? And so it's important for people working with injured folks to have, whether it's counseling or therapy or some kind of self care, some kind of ability to step away from your job and release the trauma, get out from under it. And I think making sure that you're not getting to the point of burnout will really help people deal with hearing these tragic stories day in and day out. If your mental health, if your emotional health is in a good place, then you're a lot better able to deal with it than if you run yourself ragged, working overtime, and then on top of that, you're dealing with stories of injured people. I think that can be really difficult.
Right. It's everybody needs to take care of themselves as well as everybody else they take care of on a daily basis. Yeah. Um, so sometimes, and this is another topic that you're going to talk about in your presentation. Sometimes you get the best possible outcome for your client, and sometimes you don't. And that when you are a paralegal, then that part of your job is delivering disappointing news, right?
Mhm. Right,
Um,
right.
so, what have you learned about handling that kind of interaction?
Yeah. Um, well, again, I think setting out the expectation at the beginning and explaining that this is the outcome we're seeking, but this is a possible outcome and it's not what we want, can really help to, meet the person um, in a place where they have enough information to make the decision about whether to move forward or not, right? So that is the first step, is kind of setting that early expectation so that they know there's a possibility of an outcome that they don't like. So frequently, if it's a really bad outcome, if it's like you might win your case or you might lose your case type situation, a case ending situation, then I think frequently the paralegal is wise to get an attorney involved, for a number of different reasons. But frequently, if it's okay, we lost this motion, but we're still moving forward with the case, and the client and the paralegal is able to kind of explain that, hey, we hit this roadblock, but here's our plan to get around it, then they are perfectly capable of dealing with those situations. So I think it's partly setting that expectation early on, and partly explaining to the client what is that fallback plan, what are we going to do now.
So you were a paralegal for 3 years. How long have you been a practicing attorney?
10 years this year. I just
10 years
completed
this year.
10.
Oh, congratulations. That's awesome. It's awesome. And you are a graduate of our NCAJ Next Leadership Program, and you finished that you were one of our 2023 fellows, right?
Correct. That's
Um,
right.
so, how has how has that experience of going through the next program been helpful for you?
I think it was most impactful by allowing me to really get into a position where I was getting together with other younger lawyers, and we were being really vulnerable about some of the challenges that we faced, and things like imposter syndrome. Even if you've been practicing for a few years, it can be easy to feel like, well, I'm not as experienced as these other attorneys, so I shouldn't seek out this leadership role, and those types of situations. And going through the next program, the exercises that Jess led us through, and connecting with the other attorneys in the program really let me see that that's kind of a fiction, that we shouldn't allow a lack of experience to prevent us from seeking additional experience, right? And it kind of emboldened me, and I think the whole group, to continue forward and to continue pressing for leadership positions, to keep advancing in our careers.
Great. Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. We are really proud of the next program and of all the fellows that graduated. So that's good to hear. I'm glad to know that was your experience.
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
Cool. All right. Well, we are very much looking forward to having you present at the fall conference for paralegals, and I really appreciated you being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Amber. I had so much fun.
All right. Anyone interested in attending the fall conference for paralegals can go to ncaj.com/events. That is going to be on October 18th virtually, or you can attend in person here at NCAJ headquarters. And thanks everybody for listening to the podcast.